Welcome to the Sleepy Library. It's lovely to have you here. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. A quiet bedroom, a cozy living room, perhaps nestled in blankets with the lights turned low. Maybe you're on a nighttime train, watching darkness slide past the windows. Maybe you're in a small apartment where city sounds hum softly in the background. Or perhaps you're somewhere vast and silent, where stars spread across the sky like scattered diamonds. Wherever you are, I hope you're comfortable, safe, and ready to gently settle into thought. If you enjoy these relaxing explorations and would like to hear more, a like and subscribe really helps this sleepy little channel float along. And to those of you already subscribed, thank you. Truly, your support means more than you know. Tonight, we're exploring something that has fascinated scientists, psychologists, and curious minds for generations. How do we understand women? Not through stereotypes or assumptions, but through the lens of science and psychology. And before we begin, let me say this clearly and with care. We're not here to reduce anyone to brain scans or hormone levels. We're not here to suggest that biology is destiny, or that women can be understood through simple formulas. We're here to appreciate the beautiful complexity of human beings, to understand the patterns that research has revealed, to recognize that science offers us illumination without offering us complete answers, and to honor that every person is wonderfully, gloriously unique. What we'll explore tonight is not a manual or a guide to decoding women as if they were puzzles waiting to be solved. Rather, it's an invitation to curiosity, to wonder, to a deeper appreciation of the intricate ways that biology, psychology, culture, and individual experience weave together to create the rich variation of human consciousness. We'll look at what science has discovered about the brain, about hormones, about communication patterns and emotional processing, always remembering that these discoveries describe tendencies and averages, not rigid rules or inevitable destinies. So, settle in. Let your breathing slow. Feel the gentle weight of your body supported beneath you. Let the day's concerns slip away like water through your fingers. We have a long journey ahead, through the landscapes of neuroscience and psychology, through the intricate territories of human connection and understanding. We'll move slowly, peacefully, one idea at a time. There's no rush, no need to remember everything, just an invitation to let these ideas wash over you like gentle waves. So, let's begin, shall we? The human brain is one of the most magnificent structures in the known universe. Consider for a moment what rests within your skull. Roughly 3 pounds of tissue, soft as butter, containing approximately 86 billion neurons. Each of these neurons forms connections with thousands of others, creating a network so vast, so intricate, that its complexity exceeds the number of stars in our galaxy. Within this extraordinary network, Thoughts emerge like birds taking flight. Memories form and reshape themselves with each recall. Emotions color our experience with thousands of subtle shades. And consciousness itself arises, mysterious and immediate, like morning light spreading across still water. For centuries, people wondered whether the brains of women and men were fundamentally different. Early scientists, limited by the tools of their time and often by the prejudices of their cultures, made bold claims about brain differences that reflected more about their assumptions than about reality. Some measured skull sizes and declared that larger meant more intelligent, conveniently ignoring that brain size correlates with body size and has little to do with cognitive capacity. Some examined preserved brain tissue and claimed to see structural differences that would later prove either non-existent or far more subtle than supposed. The history of brain research is, in part, a history of learning humility about how much we don't know. But in recent decades, with the advent of sophisticated brain imaging technologies, with the ability to watch living brains at work, to trace neural pathways with unprecedented precision, to study thousands of brains rather than dozens, we've begun to develop a more accurate, more nuanced picture. And the answer, as science so often reveals, is more complex and more interesting than a simple yes or no. The brains of women and men are far more similar than different, and yet there are subtle average differences that have been replicated across multiple studies, differences that may contribute to some of the variations we observe in behavior and cognition. Understanding these differences requires us to hold two truths simultaneously: that patterns exist and can be meaningful, and that individual variation vastly exceeds group averages. Let's start with what we know for certain. Research consistently shows that male brains are, on average, about 10 to 11% larger in total volume than female brains. This difference appears across multiple large-scale studies and is quite reliable. But here's something important to understand. Brain size does not correlate with intelligence. This has been demonstrated repeatedly. The size difference is proportionate to overall body size differences between the sexes, much like how heart size and lung capacity also differ on average. When we account for total brain volume and look at specific regions, the picture becomes more interesting. Some studies have found that women tend to have a slightly higher proportion of grey matter in their brains. Grey matter contains the cell bodies of neurons, the processing centers where thinking happens. Men, on the other hand, tend to have proportionally more white matter, which consists of the connections between different brain regions, the highways that allow information to travel. These differences are subtle, and there's tremendous overlap between individuals, but they hint at something fascinating. Perhaps women's brains are optimized slightly more for integration and processing, while men's brains may facilitate slightly more specialized regional activity. The hippocampus, a seahorse-shaped structure deep in the brain that plays a crucial role in memory formation and emotional processing, has been studied extensively. For years, researchers debated whether this region was larger in women. Recent comprehensive studies suggest that when adjusted for total brain size, there's no significant difference in hippocampal volume between the sexes. However, functional studies, which look at how the brain actually works, rather than just its structure, reveal something intriguing. The hippocampus appears to function somewhat differently in women and men, particularly in how memories, especially emotional memories, are encoded and retrieved. One particularly elegant study examined how people responded to emotionally charged films. The amygdala, an almond-shaped structure in each hemisphere of the brain that processes emotions, showed fascinating patterns. In women, the left amygdala was more active when forming memories of emotional events. In men, it was the right amygdala. This isn't just a trivial detail. It suggests that the emotional circuits in the brain may be organized somewhat differently, like two cities with different street layouts that both allow you to reach your destination, just via different routes. What does this mean in practical terms? Research indicates that women, on average, tend to retain stronger and more vivid memories of emotional events. They recall these memories more quickly, and the memories they retrieve contain richer sensory and emotional details. Imagine two people witnessing the same sunset. Both might remember it was beautiful, but one might recall not just the colors, but the exact way the light felt on their skin, the scent of evening air, the particular quality of quietness that settled over everything. This enhanced emotional memory isn't about one being better than the other. It's about different ways of experiencing and storing the tapestry of life. Now, let's talk about something that has generated considerable debate in neuroscience: brain connectivity. In studies examining how different regions of the brain communicate with each other, researchers have found some intriguing patterns. Women tend to show stronger connections between the left and right hemispheres of the brain, particularly in regions involved in analytical thinking and intuition. Men tend to show stronger front-to-back connections within each hemisphere. Think of it like different wiring patterns in similar computers. One might excel at tasks requiring integration of multiple types of information simultaneously, while the other might be optimized for focused, specialized processing. These connectivity differences may contribute to some of the cognitive variations researchers have observed. Women, on average, tend to perform slightly better on tasks involving verbal fluency, reading facial expressions, and multitasking. Men, on average, tend to perform slightly better on certain spatial tasks, like mental rotation of three-dimensional objects. But here's what's crucial to understand. These are average differences observed across large groups. The variation within each gender is far greater than the average difference between genders. For every trend, there are countless individuals who defy it completely. Moreover, and this is perhaps the most important point, these differences are not fixed or predetermined entirely by biology. The brain possesses something called neuroplasticity, the ability to change and reorganize itself based on experience. This isn't a minor feature of the brain, it's fundamental to how the brain works. Every experience you have, every skill you learn, every relationship you form, every thought you think repeatedly, all of these shape the physical structure of your brain. New neural connections form, existing connections strengthen or weaken. Some pathways become highways of activity, while others become overgrown paths rarely traveled. Think about what this means. A woman who regularly plays video games that involve spatial navigation will develop enhanced spatial skills, and we can see this reflected in changes to the relevant brain regions. The inferior parietal lobule, associated with spatial processing, shows increased activation and sometimes structural changes with practice. A man who practices reading subtle emotional cues, perhaps through work as a therapist or actor, will become more proficient at it. And again, we can observe corresponding changes in the brain regions involved in social cognition, like the superior temporal sulcus and the medial prefrontal cortex. The brain is not a static organ, fixed at birth or even at the end of puberty. It's more like a river, constantly flowing, constantly reshaping its banks, constantly responding to the landscape through which it moves. This fluidity means that while we can discuss average differences between groups, any individual brain is the product of that person's unique combination of genetic predisposition and lived experience. The woman sitting next to you on a bus, the woman who is your partner or friend or colleague, her brain has been shaped by her particular journey through life in ways that no group average can capture. Let's explore the brain's development more deeply, because understanding how brains develop helps us appreciate why differences emerge and how they can change. In the womb, all brains begin with similar blueprints. Early in development, the brain that will become male is exposed to surges of testosterone that influence how certain neural circuits develop. But this influence is not absolute, deterministic. It creates tendencies, slight biases in how circuits might preferentially organize. But the environment, even the environment within the womb, also shapes development. After birth, the brain enters a long period of extraordinary plasticity. Babies are born with many more neural connections than they'll ultimately keep, and the process of brain development involves not just adding connections, but also pruning them, strengthening the pathways that are used repeatedly and eliminating those that aren't. This means that the experiences a child has, the environment they grow up in, the things they practice and learn, all of these literally shape which neural pathways survive and which fade away. For girls and boys growing up in most societies, experiences differ in subtle and not so subtle ways. Girls might be given toys that emphasize caregiving and social interaction. Boys might be given toys that emphasize spatial manipulation and construction. Girls might be encouraged to pay attention to emotions and relationships. Boys might be encouraged to focus on objects and systems. These different emphases create different patterns of brain activation, which over time strengthen different neural pathways. What begins as subtle biological tendencies becomes amplified through experience and socialization. Let's shift now to something that has profound implications for understanding women: hormones. These chemical messengers flow through the bloodstream, traveling from glands to distant tissues, influencing not just reproductive functions, but mood, energy, social behavior, stress responses, and even the way we think and perceive the world. The primary sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone in women, testosterone in higher levels in men, don't just affect the body. They influence the brain in subtle but meaningful ways, creating an additional layer of complexity in how we experience being human. Estrogen, which fluctuates throughout the menstrual cycle, has been found to influence neurotransmitter systems in the brain in fascinating ways. It affects serotonin, which regulates mood, sleep, and appetite. It influences dopamine, which affects motivation, pleasure, and reward processing. It modulates norepinephrine, which is involved in alertness and focus. During parts of the menstrual cycle when estrogen is higher, particularly in the week or so leading up to ovulation, some women report feeling more energetic, more socially engaged, more verbally fluent, and more motivated. The brain during this high estrogen phase shows increased activity in regions associated with reward processing and social cognition. Then, estrogen drops, particularly in the days before menstruation, and for many women, this drop is associated with changes in mood and energy. Some experience increased emotional sensitivity, finding that things that wouldn't normally bother them feel more intense. Some experience irritability or anxiety. Some feel more fatigued or have difficulty concentrating. These premenstrual changes are real, measurable, and have a biological basis in how changing hormone levels affect neurotransmitter systems. But here's something important. These effects vary tremendously from person to person. Some women barely notice any cyclical changes in their mood or energy. They move through their menstrual cycle with no significant fluctuations in how they feel. Others experience mild shifts that they're aware of, but that don't significantly impact their daily functioning. A smaller percentage experience more intense premenstrual symptoms, sometimes severe enough to meet criteria for premenstrual dysphoric disorder, a condition where hormonal fluctuations trigger significant mood disturbance. And all of these experiences are valid variations in how female biology expresses itself. What determines where someone falls on this spectrum? Partly genetics. Some women inherit a greater sensitivity to hormonal fluctuations. Partly brain chemistry. Women who are more vulnerable to serotonin depletion tend to experience more premenstrual mood changes. Partly stress and lifestyle factors. Poor sleep, high stress, inadequate nutrition, all of these can exacerbate hormonal effects. And partly psychological factors, including past trauma or existing mood disorders, which can interact with hormonal fluctuations in complex ways. But let's zoom out and consider what this means for understanding. If you're interacting with a woman and she seems more irritable or sensitive than usual, hormonal fluctuations might be playing a role. Not as an excuse, not as something to dismiss her feelings with, but as one factor among many that might be influencing her experience. The appropriate response isn't to say, "Are you on your period?" which invalidates her feelings by reducing them to biology. The appropriate response is simply to meet her where she is, to take her feelings seriously, to offer support if it's wanted, to give space if that's needed. Progesterone, the other key female sex hormone, has its own effects. It rises in the second half of the menstrual cycle and has calming, sedating properties. It affects GABA receptors in the brain, similar to how some anti-anxiety medications work. For some women, this creates a pleasant sense of calm in the week or two after ovulation. For others, particularly if progesterone metabolites build up, it can contribute to feelings of sluggishness or even low mood. Again, there's tremendous individual variation in how people respond to their own hormonal cycles. During pregnancy, hormonal changes are dramatic. Estrogen and progesterone rise to levels far higher than in a typical menstrual cycle. The placenta produces hormones that affect the brain. Oxytocin levels increase, and for some women, these hormonal changes feel stabilizing. They experience fewer mood fluctuations during pregnancy than at other times. For others, the hormonal changes contribute to mood challenges, including prenatal anxiety, or even, in rare cases, severe mood episodes. After childbirth, hormones shift dramatically again. Estrogen and progesterone, which were high during pregnancy, plummet in the first few days after delivery. This sudden hormonal drop, combined with sleep deprivation, the enormous life change of having a newborn, and the physical recovery from birth, makes the postpartum period a time of particular vulnerability for mood disturbances. Most women experience some mood changes in the first week or two, often called the baby blues, fleeting sadness, tearfulness, irritability that resolve on their own. About 10 to 15% experience postpartum depression, a more serious condition that requires treatment. Understanding the hormonal component helps us have compassion for the challenges of this transition, without reducing the experience to mere biochemistry. Then, there's perimenopause and menopause, the transition when ovarian hormone production declines. Estrogen levels become erratic, surging and dropping unpredictably before eventually settling at lower levels. For many women, this transition brings hot flashes, sleep disturbances, and mood changes. The same mechanisms we discussed earlier, how estrogen affects neurotransmitters like serotonin, help explain why declining estrogen can contribute to mood changes for some women. But again, there's enormous variation. Some women transition through menopause with minimal symptoms. Others find it profoundly challenging. Genetics, overall health, stress levels, and psychological factors all influence the experience. Oxytocin deserves special attention in our exploration. Often called the bonding hormone or the love hormone, Oxytocin plays a fascinating role in social behavior that goes far beyond these simple nicknames. It's a small peptide hormone, just 9 amino acids long, but its effects ripple through our social and emotional lives in profound ways. Let's explore what we know about oxytocin and how it contributes to understanding women's experiences. Oxytocin is produced in the hypothalamus, a small but crucial region deep in the brain, and released by the pituitary gland into the bloodstream. It's released during childbirth, where it triggers uterine contractions, helping to bring babies into the world. It's released during breastfeeding, causing the milk ejection reflex, and simultaneously creating a sense of calm and connection between mother and infant. These reproductive roles are why oxytocin first came to scientific attention, but research has gradually discovered that oxytocin's influence extends far beyond reproductive functions. Oxytocin is released during positive social interactions. When you hug someone you care about, oxytocin rises. When you have a warm conversation with a close friend, oxytocin rises. When you gaze into the eyes of a romantic partner, oxytocin rises. When you pet a dog or cat that you have a bond with, both you and the animal experience oxytocin increases. This hormone appears to be part of the biological machinery that makes social connection feel good, that motivates us to seek out close relationships, that helps create and maintain bonds between people. The effects of oxytocin are subtle but meaningful. When oxytocin levels rise, people tend to feel calmer, less anxious, more open to connection. Trust increases slightly. Empathy becomes a bit easier to access. The ability to read facial expressions and emotional cues improves. People become more generous and cooperative. These aren't dramatic transformations, but gentle nudges toward pro-social behavior. Oxytocin makes being with others feel safe and rewarding. Research has found that women tend to have higher baseline levels of oxytocin than men. This difference appears across the lifespan, from childhood through old age, though it's particularly pronounced during reproductive years. The reasons for this difference are complex. Partly, it's direct hormonal interaction. Estrogen amplifies oxytocin's effects and can increase oxytocin production. Partly, it might be because women's brains have more oxytocin receptors in certain regions, meaning the same amount of oxytocin can have larger effects. And partly, it might be because women engage more frequently in behaviors that trigger oxytocin release, creating a positive feedback loop. This hormonal difference may partly explain why women, on average, tend to place slightly more emphasis on close relationships, show somewhat higher levels of empathy, are more attentive to emotional dynamics in groups, and are more likely to seek out social connection during times of stress. It's not that oxytocin makes someone nurturing or empathetic. Those qualities develop through experience, choice, and character. But oxytocin may create a biological tendency, a slight gravitational pull toward connection and care. Here's where it gets even more interesting. Oxytocin doesn't act in isolation. It interacts with other hormonal systems in ways that vary between women and men. In women, estrogen and oxytocin have a synergistic relationship. When estrogen is high, oxytocin's effects are amplified. The same amount of oxytocin produces stronger responses. This means that during certain phases of the menstrual cycle, when estrogen is elevated, women might feel particularly socially attuned, particularly interested in connection, particularly empathetic. In men, testosterone can actually suppress some of oxytocin's effects. This doesn't mean men don't experience or benefit from oxytocin. They absolutely do. But the balance is different. It's like how the same note played on a guitar sounds different depending on whether the other strings are resonating or dampened. The same hormone can have somewhat different influences depending on the hormonal environment in which it operates. There's also fascinating research on how oxytocin affects memory, particularly social memory. Oxytocin appears to enhance the encoding and recall of social information. Faces, emotional expressions, social contexts. This might contribute to women's enhanced ability to remember emotional events and social details. When you combine higher oxytocin levels with enhanced social attention, you get someone who is particularly good at noticing and remembering the emotional texture of interactions, who remembers not just what happened, but how people felt, who notices subtle shifts in relationships and group dynamics. But oxytocin's effects are more complex than the simple love hormone label suggests. Oxytocin doesn't make everyone friendly to everyone. It appears to enhance bonds within groups, while potentially increasing defensiveness toward outsiders. It promotes trust and cooperation with people perceived as part of one's in-group, while doing little for, or even increasing suspicion toward, those perceived as outsiders or threats. Oxytocin facilitates the bonds that hold communities together, but it doesn't create universal love. Moreover, oxytocin's effects depend heavily on context and individual differences. In people who feel secure and safe, oxytocin promotes approach and connection. But in people who feel threatened or who have experienced trauma, oxytocin can actually increase anxiety and withdrawal. It's as if oxytocin amplifies whatever social tendencies are already present, makes secure people more securely connected, but makes anxiously attached people more vigilantly attuned to potential rejection. This context dependence reminds us that hormones don't mechanistically determine behavior. They modulate, influence, create tendencies, but they always work in concert with psychology, experience, and the immediate situation. A woman with high oxytocin doesn't automatically become trusting and nurturing. Her response depends on whether she feels safe, on her attachment history, on her current emotional state, on how she interprets the social situation she's in. One of the most significant discoveries in understanding stress responses came from psychologist Shelley Taylor and her colleagues at UCLA in the year 2000. For decades, stress research focused almost exclusively on what was called the fight or flight response. This response, first described by physiologist Walter Cannon in the 1920s, seemed to capture something universal about how animals, including humans, respond to threat. When faced with danger, the body prepares to either confront the threat or escape from it. Adrenaline surges through the bloodstream. Heart rate increases, pumping blood to muscles. Breathing quickens, bringing more oxygen into the system. Digestion slows or stops, conserving energy for immediate survival. Pupils dilate, sharpening vision. Muscles tense, ready for action. Attention narrows to the immediate threat, filtering out everything except what's relevant to survival in this moment. This response was considered universal across all humans and many animal species, an ancient biological program that had kept our ancestors alive through countless dangers. But Taylor noticed something curious. Much of the stress research that established the fight or flight model had been conducted primarily on male subjects, both human and animal. This wasn't necessarily intentional bias. Early researchers often excluded female animals from studies because their hormonal cycles introduced what they saw as unwanted variability into the data. They wanted clean, consistent results, and females cycling hormones made the data messier. Similarly, in human studies, male participants were often overrepresented, particularly in research conducted before the 1990s, when regulations began requiring the inclusion of women in research. When researchers began studying women's responses to stress more carefully, paying attention not just to the physiological response, but to behavioral patterns, a different picture emerged. Women certainly experience the physiological stress response, the increased heart rate, the surge of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, the heightened alertness. But behaviorally, women showed an additional pattern, one that couldn't be easily explained by fight or flight alone. Taylor termed this pattern tend and befriend. The tending component involves nurturant activities designed to protect oneself and vulnerable others, particularly offspring, and to promote safety and reduce distress. Under stress, a mother doesn't just experience the impulse to fight or flee. She experiences a powerful impulse to protect her children, to gather them close, to tend to their needs, to ensure their safety. This makes profound evolutionary sense. A mother who fled in terror, abandoning her children, or who fought aggressively, potentially leaving her children unprotected, would risk her offspring's survival. A mother who first ensured her children were safe, who calmed them, who prepared them to move as a unit, would increase their chances of survival. The befriending component involves creating and maintaining social networks that can provide mutual protection and support. Under stress, women show a tendency to reach out to others, particularly to other women, to form alliances, to offer and seek support, to create group cohesion. Again, this makes evolutionary sense. In ancestral environments, a woman with strong social bonds, with other women who would help protect her children, share resources, offer assistance during difficult times, would have significant survival advantages. This isn't just a psychological pattern or a social construction. It has biological underpinnings. Remember oxytocin, the hormone we discussed earlier. It turns out that oxytocin is released not just during positive social interactions, but also during stress. This was a surprising discovery. Why would a bonding hormone be released during threat? The answer appears to be that oxytocin released during stress promotes affiliative behaviors in women, seeking closeness with others, offering care, building alliances, seeking support. These social responses actually help to moderate the physiological stress response. Here's how it works. Stress triggers the release of cortisol and adrenaline, which prepare the body for action. But stress also triggers oxytocin release, particularly in women, where estrogen amplifies oxytocin's effects. Oxytocin motivates social connection, reaching out to trusted others. When that social connection happens, when someone receives support or offers care to others, oxytocin levels rise further. And higher oxytocin helps to lower blood pressure, reduce cortisol levels, decrease activity in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the body's main stress system, and calm the nervous system. Social connection triggers oxytocin, which in turn helps to reduce the physiological stress response. It's a beautiful biological feedback loop, where connection becomes its own form of stress relief. This has profound implications. It suggests that women may have evolved an additional stress response strategy that complements fight or flight. While fight or flight focuses on individual survival through direct action, tend and befriend focuses on survival through social bonds and mutual support. In evolutionary terms, this makes sense. Human infants are helpless for an extraordinarily long time compared to other mammals. They need years of intensive care to reach independence. A mother alone would struggle to provide this care while also obtaining resources and protecting against threats. But a mother embedded in a network of supportive relationships with grandmothers, sisters, friends, other mothers, all helping each other, would be far more likely to successfully raise her children to adulthood. Research has documented this pattern across multiple dimensions. When faced with stress, women are more likely than men to seek emotional support from friends or family. Women are more likely to reach out, to talk through problems, to seek comfort and reassurance. Women are more likely to offer practical help to others in their network who are struggling. Women invest more time and energy in maintaining friendships and family relationships, activities that build and strengthen the social networks they can draw on during difficult times. Laboratory studies have confirmed these patterns. When researchers induce stress in controlled settings, perhaps through public speaking tasks or challenging cognitive tests, women show more of a behavioral tendency to seek proximity to others, to engage in friendly conversation, to offer and request support. Men, under the same stressful conditions, are more likely to either focus intensely on solving the problem alone or to distance themselves from others. Not always, not universally, but on average, these patterns emerge consistently. The health implications are significant. Studies following people over many years have found that women with strong social networks, with close friendships they can turn to, show better health outcomes across a range of measures. They have lower rates of depression and anxiety. They show better cardiovascular health, lower blood pressure, better heart rate variability, all indicators of better stress regulation. They show better immune function, recovering more quickly from illness. They even live longer, with some studies suggesting that strong social connections add years to life expectancy. The mechanism appears to be that chronic stress takes a toll on the body, but strong social support helps buffer against stress, leading to less cumulative wear and tear. But before we make this too simple, before we suggest that all women respond to stress by seeking connection, while all men respond by isolating or fighting, let's acknowledge the complexity. These are tendencies, not rigid categories. Individual differences matter enormously. Personality shapes stress responses. Introverted women might respond to stress differently than extroverted women. Someone with an avoidant attachment style, who learned early in life that others might not be reliably available, might respond to stress by withdrawing rather than reaching out, regardless of gender. Someone with an anxious attachment style might seek support frantically and intensely. Past trauma can reshape stress responses in ways that override typical patterns. Culture also plays a role. Some cultures place great emphasis on interdependence and collective support, which might strengthen tend and befriend patterns in everyone. Other cultures emphasize individual self-reliance, which might dampen these patterns. Gender roles within cultures vary enormously in how much they encourage or discourage help-seeking, emotional expression, and social connection. And men are certainly capable of tend and befriend responses. Fathers protect and care for their children. Men in close friendships offer each other support. Men in crisis reach out to trusted others. The research suggests that women show these patterns somewhat more consistently and more intensely on average. But the capacity for tending and befriending exists across humanity. It's part of being a social species, part of how humans have survived and thrived, not through individual prowess alone, but through our remarkable ability to cooperate, to support each other, to form communities that are stronger than any individual. What this means for understanding women is recognizing that social connection isn't optional or trivial. It's not just that women like to chat with friends or enjoy spending time with family. Social connection appears to be biologically woven into how many women regulate stress, maintain well-being, and navigate challenges. When you see a woman reaching out to friends during a difficult time, she's not being weak or overly emotional or unable to handle things on her own. She's engaging a sophisticated, adaptive strategy that helps her manage stress and maintain resilience. And if you want to support a woman going through something difficult, understanding this pattern helps. Offering practical solutions might be helpful, but offering presence, listening, emotional support, These might be more immediately valuable. Creating opportunities for connection, not forcing it, but making it available, recognizes that connection itself can be therapeutic. Respecting when someone wants to process with friends rather than alone isn't indulging neediness, but honoring a valid approach to coping. Now let's turn to something that might seem straightforward, but is actually quite fascinating and layered with complexity. Communication. If you've ever heard someone say that women use more words per day than men, or that women are naturally better communicators, you've encountered popular myths that don't hold up well under scientific scrutiny. The reality is more nuanced, more interesting, and perhaps more useful than these simplistic claims. Large-scale studies tracking how many words people actually speak throughout the day have found that women and men speak roughly the same number of words on average, around 15,000 to 16,000 words per day. Some individuals are highly talkative, regardless of gender. Some are naturally quiet. The variation within each gender far exceeds any average difference between genders. So the idea that women are inherently more verbal, in terms of sheer quantity of speech, isn't supported by evidence. But where differences do appear is not in quantity, but in style, content, and purpose. This is where things get interesting. Research on communication patterns, conducted across different cultures and age groups, suggests that women tend to use communication more for building and maintaining relationships, for exploring emotions, for creating intimacy, and for collaborative problem-solving. Conversations among women friends often involve more personal disclosure, more emotional sharing, and more supportive responses. When one person shares a problem, the response often involves empathy first. That sounds really hard. I felt that way too. Your feelings make sense. Then similar experiences might be shared, creating a sense of connection through common experience. Only later, if at all, do solutions or advice emerge. This conversational style serves important functions. It builds emotional intimacy. It creates a sense of being understood and less alone. It validates emotions. It strengthens bonds between people. When done well, it makes both participants feel closer and more connected afterward. The conversation itself is valuable, regardless of whether any problem gets solved. The process matters as much as any outcome. Men's communication patterns, on average, tend to be slightly more focused on information exchange, status negotiation, and solution-oriented discussion. A conversation might move more quickly to facts, analysis, and potential solutions. Less time might be spent exploring how people feel about something, and more time on what to do about it. This style has its own strengths. It can be efficient. It can lead to practical outcomes. It can convey expertise and build a form of connection through shared problem-solving. These differences in style emerge early. Studies of children as young as 3 or 4 years old show girls engaging in more collaborative, relationship-focused play and communication, while boys' play and communication tends to be more competitive and hierarchy-focused. By school age, these patterns are well established. Girls form close friendships characterized by intimacy and emotional sharing. Boys form friendships often centered on shared activities and playful competition. But here's what's crucial to understand. These are averages, tendencies, not absolute rules. There are women whose communication style is direct, brief, solution-focused. There are men whose style is emotionally expressive, relationship-focused, exploratory. Individual personality matters enormously. Introverts communicate differently than extroverts, regardless of gender. People who are high in agreeableness tend toward more cooperative communication styles. People high in openness to experience might enjoy abstract, imaginative conversations. The gender pattern exists, but sits atop enormous individual variation. Moreover, these patterns are shaped by both biology and socialization. Girls and boys growing up in most societies receive different messages about communication. Girls might be praised for being good listeners, for being empathetic, for maintaining social harmony, which reinforces relationship-focused communication. Boys might be praised for being direct, for solving problems independently, for being strong, which can discourage emotional expression and support-seeking. Over years of development, these different reinforcements shape communicative habits. But adults can learn new communication styles. Men can develop skill in empathetic listening and emotional exploration. Women can develop skill in direct, assertive communication. The capacity for flexibility is there. It just might require conscious effort to develop less practiced styles. And developing this flexibility makes people more effective communicators because they can adapt their approach to what the situation requires and what their conversation partner needs. Let's go deeper into specific aspects of communication where research has found consistent patterns. Interruption is one. Studies analyzing conversations have found that in mixed gender groups, men interrupt more frequently than women on average, and both genders tend to be interrupted more when they're perceived as lower status. Women, particularly in professional settings, report feeling talked over and having difficulty being heard. But there's nuance here. The type of interruption matters. Some interruptions are cooperative, adding to what someone is saying, showing enthusiasm and engagement. Other interruptions are competitive, derailing what someone is saying to redirect attention to oneself. Men tend to engage in more competitive interruptions, while women engage in more cooperative interruptions. Another pattern involves questions and statements. Women, on average, tend to ask more questions in conversation, which can serve multiple functions. Questions invite others to share, which builds connection and shows interest. Questions gather information and perspectives. Questions can also sometimes avoid making direct statements that might be seen as too assertive. Men tend to make more statements, which conveys information and establishes expertise, but might come across as dominating airtime. Turn-taking is another area. Women tend to be more attentive to balanced turn-taking in conversation, monitoring whether everyone has had chances to speak, and sometimes actively inviting quieter participants into the discussion. Men, particularly in competitive or professional settings, might focus less on balanced participation and more on advancing their own points. Then there's the use of qualifiers and hedges. Women, on average, use more qualifiers in their speech. "I think maybe we should consider," versus "we should do this." "This might not be right, but," versus "the answer is." These linguistic choices can serve social functions. They sound less domineering. They invite collaboration. They signal openness to other views. But they can also undermine authority and make speakers sound less confident than they actually are. Compliments show interesting patterns. Women give and receive more compliments than men, and compliments between women often function to build rapport and show appreciation. Between men, compliments are less frequent and often function differently, sometimes establishing hierarchy rather than equality. Apologies also differ. Women, on average, apologize more frequently than men. This could reflect different thresholds for what constitutes offense worth apologizing for, with women perceiving smaller social transgressions as requiring apology. Or it could reflect social conditioning that encourages women to smooth social interactions and take responsibility for harmony. Whatever the cause, the pattern exists, and can create misunderstandings when women's frequent apologies are interpreted as weakness rather than social grace. All of these patterns have implications for understanding. If you notice that a woman uses more qualifiers in her speech, it doesn't necessarily mean she lacks confidence. She might be using linguistic strategies to sound collaborative and open. If a woman asks many questions, she's not necessarily uncertain. She might be actively building connection and inviting participation. If a woman apologizes frequently, it might reflect social skill rather than excessive guilt. Conversely, if you're a woman communicating with someone who doesn't share these patterns, who speaks more directly, uses fewer qualifiers, makes more statements than asks questions, this doesn't necessarily mean they're trying to dominate or that they're not interested in your perspective. They might simply have different conversational defaults. Understanding these patterns as style differences rather than right or wrong ways to communicate helps bridge potential gaps. Non-verbal communication is where some of the most fascinating and consistent gender differences appear. Research spanning several decades across numerous cultures, with participants from childhood through old age, has found that women, on average, are significantly better at reading facial expressions, interpreting tone of voice, and picking up on subtle emotional cues in body language. This isn't a small effect. In study after study, women demonstrate higher accuracy in identifying emotions from non-verbal information. Let's explore what this means and why it matters. One landmark study developed something called the PONS test, the Profile of Nonverbal Sensitivity, created by psychologist Robert Rosenthal and his colleagues at Harvard. The test consists of video clips showing a woman expressing various emotions, including maternal love, jealousy, gratitude, seductiveness, seeking forgiveness, and anger. In each clip, the audio is muffled so you can't understand the words, forcing viewers to rely on non-verbal cues. Sometimes only the face is visible, sometimes only the body. Sometimes both are shown, but with the face obscured. The challenge is to identify what emotion or scenario is being expressed based solely on non-verbal information. When this test was administered to thousands of people from third grade through college and beyond, a striking pattern emerged. In over 77% of the studies, females outperformed males in accurately identifying the emotions being expressed. This advantage appeared across ages, though it tended to be slightly larger in adults than children, suggesting both biological predisposition and learned skill contributed to the pattern. The advantage appeared across different cultural contexts, suggesting something relatively universal about this gender difference. Why might this difference exist? Several theories have been proposed, and the truth likely involves multiple factors. One evolutionary theory suggests that women who could accurately read the emotional states of pre-verbal infants would be better able to respond to their needs, whether the baby was hungry, tired, frightened, or in pain. Enhanced ability to read emotions would improve infant survival, and over thousands of generations, this could lead to selection for enhanced emotional reading ability in women. Another theory points to power dynamics. Groups with less social power often develop enhanced ability to read the emotions and intentions of those with more power, as a survival strategy. Knowing whether the more powerful person is pleased or angry, trustworthy or deceptive, can be crucial for navigating situations safely. Throughout much of human history, women have held less formal power than men in most societies, which might have created pressure to develop skill in reading others' emotions. A third theory focuses on social role. Women in most societies have been primarily responsible for childcare and for managing social relationships within families and communities. These roles require skill in emotional reading, in noticing when someone is upset, in mediating conflicts, in maintaining social harmony. The roles women typically held provided extensive practice in emotional reading, which developed and refined the skill. All of these factors might contribute. Biological predisposition might create a slight initial advantage that is then amplified through social expectations and accumulated practice. What we end up with is a measurable, consistent difference in ability to read nonverbal emotional cues, with women showing enhanced skill on average. What does this enhanced nonverbal sensitivity look like in practice? Women are better at identifying subtle facial expressions, the micro-expressions that flash across someone's face before they can consciously control their expression. They're more accurate in distinguishing genuine smiles, where the muscles around the eyes contract, from social smiles that only involve the mouth. They're better at reading body language, interpreting what crossed arms or forward lean or particular postures might indicate about someone's emotional state. They're more sensitive to tone of voice, picking up on whether someone sounds genuinely enthusiastic or just polite, truly angry or mildly annoyed, sad or simply tired. This skill has significant advantages. In relationships, being able to accurately read a partner's emotions, even when they're not explicitly stated, can help avoid misunderstandings and respond to needs before they're articulated. In parenting, reading a child's emotional state helps provide appropriate responses. In social situations, reading the room, knowing who is uncomfortable or upset or enthusiastic, helps navigate complex social dynamics gracefully. In professional settings, reading clients' or colleagues' unspoken reactions can inform better decisions. But enhanced emotional sensitivity can also have costs. Being highly attuned to others' emotions can be exhausting, constantly processing emotional information from everyone around you. It can lead to emotional contagion, absorbing others' distress or anxiety. It can create a sense of responsibility for managing others' emotions, trying to make everyone comfortable and happy. It can make it difficult to attend to one's own needs when constantly attuned to others. Moreover, skill in reading emotions doesn't automatically translate to knowing how to respond. Someone might accurately perceive that a friend is angry, but struggle with whether to address it directly or give space. They might notice a colleague is stressed, but not know whether offering help would be welcome or intrusive. Reading emotions is a separate skill from emotional intelligence, though they often go together. Men's somewhat lower average performance on emotional reading tasks doesn't mean men are incapable of reading emotions. Many men are highly skilled at it, particularly men in professions that require emotional sensitivity, like therapists, actors, salespeople, or teachers. And men can improve with practice and motivation. Studies have shown that when men are told that emotional reading is important or are given feedback on their performance, the gender gap narrows significantly. This suggests that at least part of the difference reflects motivation and practice, not just innate ability. Interestingly, the context of emotion reading matters. Women show advantages particularly for reading subtle, ambiguous emotional cues. When emotional expressions are very clear and obvious, the gender difference shrinks or disappears. It's in the realm of nuance, of detecting subtle shifts in expression, of noticing incongruence between verbal and non-verbal messages, where women's advantage is most pronounced. There are also differences in what emotions are most easily read. Women show particular advantages in reading fear and sadness in others, which makes sense from a caregiving perspective, where detecting distress is crucial. Both genders are relatively good at reading anger, which also makes sense, as recognizing threat is universally important for survival. Happiness is generally the easiest emotion to read for everyone. Positive emotions tend to be expressed more openly. Body language, beyond facial expressions, also shows patterns. Women tend to adopt more open postures when feeling comfortable, using gestures that are more expansive and expressive. They tend to maintain more eye contact during conversations, which builds connection, but can also be interpreted as submission in some contexts. Women tend to smile more frequently than men, which serves social functions of creating warmth and approachability, but can sometimes undermine perceptions of authority. Men tend to adopt postures that take up more space, which conveys confidence and status. They maintain less eye contact, particularly with other men, as sustained eye contact between males can be interpreted as challenge. They smile less frequently, but when they do smile, it often serves specific communicative functions. These differences in body language start appearing in childhood and become more pronounced through adolescence and adulthood, as gender norms become internalized. Touch is another dimension of non-verbal communication that shows gender patterns. Women tend to touch friends more frequently in conversation. Brief touches on the arm or shoulder that convey warmth and connection. Women are generally more comfortable with physical closeness, sitting nearer to friends, hugging more readily. Men in many Western cultures maintain greater physical distance, except in specific contexts like sports or greetings, where ritualized touch is acceptable. Cultural context profoundly shapes all of these nonverbal patterns. Mediterranean and Latin American cultures tend to involve more touch, closer physical proximity, and more expressive gestures than Northern European or East Asian cultures. Gender differences exist within all cultures, but the baseline varies dramatically. A woman from an expressive culture might seem emotionally intense to someone from a more reserved culture, while a woman from a reserved culture might seem cold or distant to someone from a more expressive culture. Understanding these nonverbal patterns helps in several ways. It helps you interpret others' behavior more accurately, recognizing that someone's body language or facial expressions might be telling you things their words aren't. It helps you communicate more effectively by being intentional about your own nonverbal messages. It helps you recognize cultural and gender differences in communication style without judging them as right or wrong. And it helps you develop empathy by paying attention to the full spectrum of human communication, not just the words, but all the subtle ways we signal our inner states to each other. Emotional intelligence has become a buzzword in recent decades, but the concept has real substance. Emotional intelligence refers to the ability to recognize, understand, and manage one's own emotions, and to recognize and influence the emotions of others. It includes self-awareness, knowing what you're feeling and why, self-regulation, managing your emotions effectively, social awareness, accurately perceiving others' emotions, and relationship management, using emotional understanding to communicate effectively and build strong relationships. Multiple studies have found that women tend to score slightly higher on emotional intelligence measures, particularly in areas of empathy and social awareness. This doesn't mean women are more emotional. Experiencing emotions and understanding emotions are different things. What it suggests is that women may be somewhat more attuned to the emotional landscape of social interactions, both their own internal emotional world and the emotions of others around them. This enhanced emotional awareness can be a tremendous strength. In leadership, women with high emotional intelligence often create work environments characterized by strong communication, psychological safety, and team cohesion. In relationships, emotional intelligence supports deeper connection, more effective conflict resolution, and greater mutual understanding. But it can also present challenges. Being highly attuned to others' emotions can be exhausting. It can lead to over-responsibility for others' feelings or difficulty setting boundaries. Research on women in leadership roles revealed something interesting about how emotional intelligence manifests. Women leaders who demonstrate empathy, collaborative decision-making, and authentic communication often inspire deep loyalty and trust in their teams. However, they sometimes face a challenging paradox. Society often holds contradictory expectations for women in leadership. Be strong but not aggressive. Be warm but not weak. Be confident but not arrogant. Be collaborative but decisive. Women who lead with emotional intelligence often navigate this paradox by creating what researchers call a synergistic blend of qualities. They combine traditionally feminine communication styles, like inclusive language and active listening, with traditionally masculine qualities, like decisive action and clear direction. The most effective women leaders don't try to imitate men or suppress their natural communication style. They develop an authentic approach that draws on multiple dimensions of leadership. Let's talk about empathy, because it's central to understanding how women navigate the world. Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another person. It has both cognitive components, understanding what someone else is thinking and feeling, and emotional components, actually feeling resonance with another person's emotional state. Research consistently finds that women, on average, show higher levels of both cognitive and emotional empathy. Brain imaging studies have provided clues about the neural basis of empathy. When watching someone else experience pain or distress, certain regions of the brain activate as if we ourselves were experiencing it. These mirror systems are thought to underlie our ability to understand others' experiences. Some studies have found that these empathy-related brain regions show stronger or more sustained activation in women when viewing emotional content. But empathy is not automatic or inevitable. It develops through experience and can be enhanced or diminished by various factors. Children who grow up in emotionally attuned families tend to develop stronger empathy. Conversely, trauma or chronic stress can sometimes dampen empathetic responses as a protective mechanism. Culture also plays a role. Some cultures place greater emphasis on emotional expression and interpersonal harmony, which can foster empathy development. The interplay between empathy and oxytocin is particularly intriguing. Studies have shown that administering oxytocin can temporarily increase empathetic responses and the ability to read emotional expressions. Women's naturally higher oxytocin levels may contribute to their somewhat higher average empathy. But it's a two-way street. Engaging in empathetic behavior, like comforting a friend or volunteering to help others, can trigger oxytocin release, creating a positive feedback loop where connection breeds more connection. Now, let's explore something that bridges biology and psychology: attachment theory. Developed by psychologist John Bowlby and later expanded by Mary Ainsworth, attachment theory examines how early relationships shape our patterns of relating to others throughout life. In infancy, we develop attachment styles based on how consistently and sensitively our caregivers respond to our needs. These early patterns create internal working models of relationships that influence how we connect with others as adults. Research on attachment has revealed some interesting patterns. Women and men show similar distributions of attachment styles overall. Both genders can be securely attached, anxiously attached, avoidantly attached, or show disorganized attachment. However, some studies suggest subtle differences in how attachment styles manifest. Women with anxious attachment may be more likely to express their anxiety through seeking reassurance and emotional expression, while men with anxious attachment might express it through jealousy or possessiveness. Women with avoidant attachment might maintain independence through busyness and self-sufficiency, while men might maintain it through emotional distance or focus on work. What's particularly relevant to understanding women is how attachment interacts with the stress responses we discussed earlier. Women with secure attachment, who trust that others will be there for them, readily engage in tend and befriend behaviors during stress. They reach out to friends, seek support, and offer care to others. Women with avoidant attachment, who learned early that others might not be reliably available, may actually suppress the tend and befriend response and become more fight or flight oriented under stress, contradicting the general pattern. This reminds us that individual psychology and life experience powerfully shape how any biological tendency manifests. Friendship patterns reveal some fascinating aspects of how women connect. Research on same-gender friendships has found that women's friendships tend to be characterized by higher levels of emotional intimacy, self-disclosure, and emotional support compared to men's friendships. Women friends are more likely to discuss feelings, personal challenges, and relationship issues. They're more likely to provide emotional comfort and empathy to each other. This doesn't mean women's friendships are superior or that men's friendships lack depth. Men's friendships often revolve around shared activities, humor, and practical support. Neither style is better. They're different approaches to connection, each with their own strengths. But understanding these patterns helps explain why female friendships can feel particularly emotionally nourishing, and why women often report that their close female friends are essential to their well-being. Interestingly, these close female friendships aren't just emotionally important. They have measurable health benefits. Studies have found that women with strong social networks and close friendships show lower rates of depression, better cardiovascular health, and even longer lifespans. The mechanism appears to involve stress reduction. As we discussed, social connection triggers oxytocin release, which helps regulate stress responses. Women who can turn to friends during difficult times experience less severe physiological stress responses, which over time translates to better health outcomes. Let's turn now to something that affects understanding in profound ways: context sensitivity. Research suggests that women may be somewhat more context-sensitive than men in their social cognition and behavior. Context sensitivity means being attuned to situational factors, reading the room, adjusting behavior based on subtle social cues, and recognizing that the same action might mean different things in different contexts. Studies on moral reasoning have found that women tend to incorporate more contextual information into their judgments. Faced with an ethical dilemma, women are somewhat more likely to ask clarifying questions, to consider the specific relationships involved, to weigh competing obligations before making a judgment. Men, on average, are slightly more likely to apply abstract principles consistently across contexts. Again, these are tendencies, not absolutes, and both approaches have value. This context sensitivity may relate to the enhanced social cognition we've been discussing. Reading nonverbal cues, perceiving emotions accurately, and thinking about how others feel all require attending to contextual details. Someone who is skilled at noticing that a friend's smile doesn't reach their eyes, or that someone's agreeable words are contradicted by their tense posture, is demonstrating context sensitivity. But context sensitivity can also present challenges. Being highly attuned to social context can sometimes lead to overthinking, to excessive concern about others' reactions, or to difficulty being direct when situations call for it. Women who are highly context-sensitive might struggle with situations that require ignoring context and applying rules uniformly, or with making decisions when the contextual information is ambiguous or conflicting. Let's discuss something that often creates misunderstanding: different conversational purposes. Research on communication has identified that people engage in conversation for different purposes, and gender patterns emerge in which purposes tend to be prioritized. Women's conversations, particularly with other women, often serve what linguists call rapport talk. The purpose is to establish connection, to create a sense of shared experience, to offer support, and to maintain relationships. The content matters, but the process of connecting matters equally. Men's conversations, particularly with other men, more often serve what linguists call report talk. The purpose is to exchange information, to establish expertise or status, to solve problems, or to negotiate positions. Again, this doesn't mean men don't care about connection, or that women can't be direct and information-focused. It means the default orientations differ slightly. What happens when these different conversational purposes meet? Misunderstandings can arise. A woman might share a problem, not because she wants a solution, but because talking about it with someone who listens empathetically is itself helpful. A man, oriented toward report talk, might immediately offer solutions, which can feel dismissive if what was wanted was empathy. Conversely, a man might present information or discuss ideas without much personal framing, which a woman might perceive as cold or impersonal, when what he intended was straightforward communication. When people understand these different purposes, they can adapt. A man can learn to listen empathetically first, to validate emotions before moving to problem solving. A woman can learn to be explicit about whether she wants empathy or solutions. Both can develop flexibility to move between rapport and report modes depending on the situation. This isn't about changing who you are, it's about expanding your communicative repertoire. Conflict resolution styles also show some interesting patterns. Research suggests that women are somewhat more likely to use indirect conflict strategies, like hinting, avoiding, or enlisting third parties, while men are more likely to use direct confrontation. But context matters enormously. In situations where women feel safe and empowered, they're quite capable of direct confrontation. In situations where men fear damage to relationships they value, they might avoid or use indirect approaches. What's perhaps most important is understanding that indirect approaches aren't inherently weaker or less effective than direct confrontation. In some contexts, indirect approaches preserve relationships and allow face-saving, which can lead to more sustainable resolutions. In other contexts, direct confrontation clears the air and establishes boundaries more effectively. Flexibility matters more than adhering to one style. Let's explore cognitive styles and information processing. While there's enormous overlap between genders, some cognitive differences have been consistently observed. Women, on average, tend to show advantages in verbal tasks, like verbal fluency, reading comprehension, and verbal memory. Men, on average, tend to show advantages in certain spatial tasks, particularly mental rotation of three-dimensional objects. But here's what's fascinating. These differences are not fixed. Training can dramatically reduce or even eliminate them. Women who play action video games show improved spatial skills. Men who engage in regular reading and vocabulary practice show enhanced verbal skills. This demonstrates that while there may be initial differences, perhaps based on brain organization or hormonal influences, these differences are malleable and responsive to experience. Moreover, the size of these differences been shrinking over time as educational opportunities and gender roles have become more equitable. Decades ago, the gap in spatial skills was larger. As more girls have been encouraged to engage in spatial activities like building toys, sports, and certain video games, the gap has narrowed. This tells us that much of what we might have attributed to fixed biological differences was actually influenced by different experiences and opportunities. What about multitasking? There's a popular belief that women are better multitaskers than men. The research on this is actually mixed. Some studies have found small advantages for women in certain multitasking situations, while other studies have found no difference. What seems clear is that true multitasking, doing two cognitively demanding tasks simultaneously, is extremely difficult for everyone. What people often call multitasking is actually rapid task switching. Women may show a slight advantage in task switching situations that require integrating multiple types of information or maintaining awareness of several ongoing situations simultaneously. This might relate to the stronger interhemispheric connectivity we discussed earlier. But again, the difference, if it exists, is small and highly variable across individuals. Let's talk about something important: mental health and well-being. Women experience higher rates of certain mental health conditions, particularly depression and anxiety disorders. Why? The answer is complex and involves biological, psychological, and social factors. Hormonally, the fluctuations in estrogen and progesterone throughout the menstrual cycle, during pregnancy, and during menopause can influence mood regulation. Some women are particularly sensitive to these hormonal changes. But hormones are only part of the story. Women also face specific social stressors. They're more likely to experience certain types of trauma, like sexual violence. They often face discrimination and sexism. They may experience role strain trying to balance multiple demanding roles. They're more likely to be primary caregivers for children and aging parents. And perhaps most relevant to our earlier discussion, women's higher empathy and context sensitivity can sometimes become liabilities. Being highly attuned to others' emotions can lead to emotional contagion, absorbing others' distress. Being context sensitive can lead to overthinking and rumination. The very qualities that make women skilled at connection and empathy can, under stress, contribute to anxiety and depression. It's not that these qualities are bad. It's that without good boundaries and self-care, they can become overwhelming. But here's something hopeful. The same social connection that can sometimes be a source of stress is also one of women's greatest protective factors. Women who have strong social support, who can turn to trusted friends or family, show better resilience in the face of adversity. Remember the tend and befriend response. It's not just about protecting others, it's about receiving support too. The social bonds women cultivate serve as buffers against stress and sources of strength during difficult times. Let's explore one more crucial area: the development of identity and sense of self. Psychologist Carol Gilligan proposed that women's sense of self tends to be more relational than men's. While men's identity development often focuses on separation, individuation, and autonomy, women's identity development often emphasizes connection, relationships, and interdependence. A woman might define herself significantly in terms of her relationships, as a daughter, friend, partner, mother. Not because she lacks individual identity, but because relationships are central to how she experiences meaning and purpose. This isn't universal, and it's been debated whether these differences are innate or socially constructed. Probably both factors contribute. But understanding that someone might experience their self as fundamentally connected to others helps explain many things. It explains why relational conflict can feel so destabilizing, why maintaining relationships often takes such priority, why women might be more willing to compromise individual desires for the sake of relationship harmony. But it also highlights a potential vulnerability. If your sense of self is deeply embedded in relationships, then threats to relationships, like rejection or abandonment, can feel like threats to your very identity. This might partly explain why women sometimes struggle more with breakups, and why relationship quality is so strongly linked to women's well-being. It's not weakness, it's a different way of constructing meaning and identity. Let's explore one more crucial area before we bring our journey to a close: cognitive strengths and collaborative decision-making. Throughout this exploration, we've touched on various cognitive differences, like verbal abilities and spatial skills. But there's a broader pattern worth understanding about how women often approach thinking, problem-solving, and decision-making, particularly in social contexts. Research on cognitive styles has identified what psychologists call field dependence versus field independence. Field-independent thinkers tend to separate elements from their context, to analyze things in isolation, to apply abstract rules consistently. Field-dependent thinkers tend to perceive things holistically, to consider context heavily, to integrate multiple sources of information simultaneously. Women, on average, show slightly more field-dependent cognitive styles, while men show slightly more field-independent styles. What does this mean practically? It means that women, when faced with a complex problem, might naturally consider more contextual factors, more social implications, more nuances of the specific situation. Men might more readily apply general principles or abstract rules without as much contextual adjustment. Neither approach is better universally. Both have strengths in different contexts. Abstract principled thinking excels in situations requiring consistency and clear boundaries. Contextual holistic thinking excels in complex social situations where flexibility and nuance matter. This connects to something fascinating about women in collaborative decision-making. Studies of how mixed gender groups solve problems have found that women's participation improves group outcomes, but not necessarily because women always have the best ideas individually. Rather, women tend to facilitate better group processes. They're more likely to ensure everyone's ideas get heard, to integrate different perspectives, to notice and address interpersonal tensions that might be interfering with productive discussion, to build on others' contributions rather than dismissing them. This facilitative style can be undervalued in cultures that celebrate individual brilliance and competitive debate. The person who has the breakthrough insight gets credit, while the person who created the conditions for that insight to emerge often goes unrecognized. But research on team performance consistently shows that psychological safety, where everyone feels comfortable contributing, and balanced participation, where diverse perspectives are heard, predict better outcomes than having one brilliant person dominate. Women's tendency toward collaborative rather than competitive communication styles contributes to creating these productive team dynamics. When women lead, teams often report feeling more heard, more valued, and more cohesive. This doesn't mean women are better leaders across all contexts. In crisis situations requiring rapid, decisive action, more directive leadership might be needed. In highly competitive environments, a more aggressive approach might yield better immediate results. But in complex knowledge work requiring innovation and sustained collaboration, the collaborative styles women often bring create advantages. There's also something worth understanding about women's approaches to risk and uncertainty. Research in behavioral economics has found that women, on average, make slightly more risk-averse financial decisions than men. Women are less likely to engage in risky investments, more likely to prefer stable returns, more likely to save rather than spend. This pattern has sometimes been interpreted as women being overly cautious or not understanding finance. but it might actually reflect greater recognition of downside risks and consequences. When researchers account for overconfidence, an area where men tend to score higher, the apparent risk aversion partly reflects more accurate assessment. Overconfident people often underestimate risks and make objectively riskier decisions while feeling confident. More accurately calibrated people recognize uncertainty and act accordingly. Women's apparent risk aversion might partly reflect better calibrated confidence and more realistic assessment of uncertainty. This has implications for understanding women's decision-making. A woman who seems hesitant about a decision isn't necessarily being indecisive. She might be appropriately weighing a wider range of factors, considering more potential outcomes, thinking through implications that haven't been immediately obvious. Sometimes this caution prevents costly mistakes. Sometimes it leads to missed opportunities. The key is recognizing it as a different approach to uncertainty rather than a deficit. Let's talk about intuition, because it's often associated with women and often misunderstood. Intuition isn't magical or mysterious. It's the brain's ability to detect patterns based on accumulated experience, operating faster than conscious analytical thinking. When someone has a gut feeling about something, their brain has recognized patterns based on past experiences, but this recognition happens below conscious awareness. Women's greater attention to social cues, emotional information, and contextual details means they accumulate different experiential data than men on average. This can lead to intuitions that seem mysterious, but actually reflect sophisticated pattern recognition. When a woman has a bad feeling about someone, she might not be able to articulate exactly why, but her brain has detected something in their micro-expressions, tone, body language, or behavior patterns that triggered warning based on past experience. This kind of intuition deserves respect, not dismissal. It's not infallible, no intuition is, but it reflects real processing of real information. Just information that hasn't been consciously analyzed. In situations involving people, relationships, and complex social dynamics, women's intuitions are often worth taking seriously, even when they can't be immediately logically explained. Now, as we prepare to draw our long exploration to a close, let's reflect on what all of this means for the practical question of understanding women. We've journeyed through neuroscience, learning about brain structure and connectivity. We've explored hormones, understanding how oxytocin and estrogen influence social behavior and emotion regulation. We've examined stress responses, discovering the tend and befriend pattern. We've investigated communication styles, nonverbal sensitivity, emotional intelligence, and cognitive approaches. We've accumulated a wealth of information about patterns and tendencies. But information without wisdom can be more confusing than helpful. So let's distill some practical wisdom from all we've explored. First, patterns are real, but individuals are more real. Everything we've discussed describes averages across large groups. The woman in front of you might fit none of these patterns, some of them, or all of them. Always approach individuals with curiosity rather than assumption. Let what you've learned inform your questions and attention, but let the particular person tell you who they actually are. Second, different doesn't mean deficient. Women's communication styles, stress responses, cognitive approaches, they're not worse than men's, just different. Each approach has strengths and limitations. Each is valuable in different contexts. Understanding differences helps bridge gaps and build on complementary strengths, not to establish hierarchies. Third, biology isn't destiny. Yes, hormones influence mood and behavior. Yes, brain structure shapes cognitive tendencies. But neuroplasticity, learning, and choice mean people can develop beyond their initial tendencies. The brain a woman has at 20 is not the brain she'll have at 50. Experience continuously reshapes us. Hold biological information lightly as one factor among many, never as a deterministic explanation. Fourth, context always matters. A woman's behavior in one setting might be completely different in another. Her communication style with close friends might differ from her professional style. Her stress response when she feels safe might differ from when she feels threatened. Don't assume that how someone shows up in one context is how they always are. Humans are wonderfully adaptive and context-sensitive. Fifth, understanding is always incomplete and always evolving. You will never fully understand anyone, including yourself. The project of understanding is endless, and that's okay. What matters is staying curious, staying open, staying willing to revise your understanding when you learn something new. The goal isn't perfect comprehension, but humble, caring attention. What matters most, ultimately, isn't memorizing facts about gender differences, but cultivating a quality of presence and attention that honors the full humanity of the people we encounter. This means listening not just to words, but to tone, body language, what isn't said. It means asking questions when you're uncertain, rather than assuming. It means noticing your assumptions and holding them lightly. It means caring enough about someone to try to see the world through their eyes, even when their view differs from yours. It means recognizing that the women in your life, whether partners, friends, family members, colleagues, or strangers, carry within them depths you can never fully access. Their inner lives are as rich and complex as your own. Their experiences have shaped them in ways you can only partially understand. Their hopes and fears, their joys and sorrows, their particular way of making meaning, all of this exists in them fully and completely, regardless of whether you understand it. Your task, and it's a beautiful task, is simply to show up with respect, curiosity, and care. To listen more than you speak sometimes. To pay attention to what someone is telling you through all their channels of communication. To honor their feelings, even when you don't fully understand them. To support their autonomy while offering connection. To recognize both their strength and their vulnerability. To see them as whole human beings, not as puzzles to solve or categories to understand. What science offers us is not a manual for understanding women as if they were a single category of being, but rather insights into some general patterns that might help us be more curious, more empathetic, and more nuanced in how we understand the people in our lives. When we understand that someone might respond to stress by seeking connection rather than isolating, we can offer the kind of support that will actually be helpful. When we understand that someone might prioritize emotional rapport in conversation, we can meet them there, rather than wondering why they're not getting to the point. But we must always hold this knowledge lightly, ready to revise our assumptions when the particular person in front of us doesn't match the pattern. Every woman is a universe unto herself, shaped by genetics, hormones, brain structure, life experiences, culture, relationships, choices, and 100 other factors we haven't even discussed. Science can illuminate tendencies. It cannot capture the full mystery and beauty of any individual human being. What matters most is not memorizing facts about average differences, but cultivating curiosity. Approaching others with genuine interest in understanding their particular way of experiencing the world. Asking questions instead of making assumptions. Listening with full attention to what someone tells you about their inner life, their needs, their feelings, their perspective. Being willing to be wrong about your assumptions and to revise them. Understanding women, understanding anyone really, is an ongoing practice, not a destination. It requires humility, the recognition that we can never fully understand another person's subjective experience. It requires empathy, the attempt to feel with another person, even when their experience differs from our own. It requires patience, because people are complex and often contradictory, revealing themselves slowly over time. And it requires love, the decision to keep showing up with curiosity and care, even when understanding feels elusive. The women in your life, whether partners, friends, family members, colleagues, or strangers you pass on the street, each carry within them a richness of experience that no amount of scientific research can fully capture. They each have their own histories, their own wounds and triumphs, their own ways of making meaning. Some might fit the patterns we've discussed tonight. Some might defy them entirely. And many will fit some patterns while contradicting others, because human beings are beautifully inconsistent. What we can do is bring to our interactions an informed curiosity. When we notice that someone responds to stress by reaching out rather than withdrawing, we can recognize that as one possible pattern and respond with availability. When we notice that someone processes emotion differently than we do, we can honor that difference rather than judging it. When we notice that someone prioritizes relationship harmony, we can appreciate that value even if our own priorities differ. We can also recognize our own limitations. Perhaps we're not naturally skilled at reading emotional cues. Perhaps we tend toward directness and struggle with contextual nuance. Perhaps we find emotional intensity overwhelming. These limitations don't make us deficient, they make us human. But we can develop compensatory strategies, ask clarifying questions when we're unsure what someone is feeling, be explicit about our own communication preferences, give ourselves breaks when emotional intensity becomes too much. The goal isn't to become perfect at understanding women or understanding anyone. The goal is to become slightly more aware, slightly more skilled, slightly more compassionate in our interactions. To recognize that behind every face is a consciousness as vast and complex as our own. To approach each person as a mystery to be appreciated, rather than a puzzle to be solved. To hold our generalizations lightly, while attending carefully to the particular human being in front of us. There's something both humbling and liberating in recognizing how much we don't and can't fully know about others. Humbling because it reveals the limits of our understanding. Liberating because it releases us from the impossible burden of perfect comprehension. We don't need to understand everything about someone to connect with them, to care about them, to treat them with kindness and respect. Sometimes, often even, the most powerful thing we can say is simply, "I don't fully understand, but I'm here and I care." Women are not a problem to be solved or a code to be cracked. They're human beings, with all the complexity that entails. The science we've explored tonight offers some signposts, some patterns that might help us navigate social interactions with greater awareness. But the map is not the territory. The research describes averages and tendencies. The individual woman you interact with tomorrow might conform to every pattern we've discussed, or might contradict all of them. And both possibilities are completely valid. What the science really offers, if we hold it wisely, is an invitation to curiosity, an invitation to wonder about how someone experiences the world, to ask questions, to listen, to notice, to appreciate that there are different ways of processing information, different communication styles, different approaches to relationships, different stress responses, and that this diversity is not a problem, but a profound gift. Imagine how impoverished human society would be if we all processed the world identically. The differences between people, including the average differences between women and men, create opportunities for complementarity, for learning from each other, for balancing each other's strengths and compensating for each other's limitations. When someone who excels at reading emotional nuance partners with someone who excels at logical problem solving, together they can navigate complexity that neither could handle alone. When someone who naturally tends toward connection partners with someone who champions independence, they can help each other find balance between intimacy and autonomy. But this complementarity only works when it's based on mutual respect, not on rigid stereotypes. When we appreciate different strengths without ranking them hierarchically, when we recognize that traditional feminine qualities like empathy and relationality are just as valuable as traditional masculine qualities like decisiveness and independence. That emotional intelligence is intelligence. That the capacity for deep connection is a profound human strength, not a weakness. Perhaps the most important thing science can teach us about understanding women is that understanding must always remain provisional, open, responsive to new information. The person you thought you understood reveals new dimensions. Research findings get updated or nuanced by new studies. Cultural contexts shift, creating new ways of being. We must hold our knowledge the way we hold sand at the beach, gently, knowing that it will slip through our fingers if we grasp too tightly, but that we can enjoy its texture and form while we hold it loosely in our open palm. And maybe, ultimately, understanding is less about accumulating facts and more about cultivating a quality of attention. The kind of attention that notices when someone's words and body language don't match, that hears not just what someone says, but how they say it, that picks up on what's not said, the silences and hesitations that sometimes speak more loudly than words, that remains present with someone even in moments of confusion or disagreement, that stays curious rather than jumping to conclusions. This kind of attention is a practice, a skill developed over time through countless interactions. It's also a gift, a way of honoring the person in front of you by really seeing them, by making space for their full complexity. When we offer this quality of attention to the women in our lives, we're not just understanding them better, we're participating in their becoming, creating a space where they can more fully be themselves. As we come toward the end of our exploration tonight, let's hold one more thought. The deepest understanding often comes not through analysis, but through relationship. You can study brain scans and hormone levels and communication patterns, and all of that has value. But the understanding that truly transforms us comes from being in authentic relationship with people, from the vulnerability of showing up as ourselves and inviting others to do the same, from the countless small moments of connection that accumulate over time into genuine knowing. So, by all means, let what we've explored tonight inform your curiosity. Let it offer you frameworks for thinking about human behavior. Let it help you recognize patterns and possibilities you might not have considered before. But don't let it replace the irreplaceable experience of really listening to someone tell you who they are, of paying attention to how they move through the world, of asking them directly what they need rather than assuming you know. And remember, finally, that the question, how do we understand women, is really a subset of the larger question of how we understand anyone, how we bridge the gap between consciousnesses, how we reach across the inevitable loneliness of being locked inside our own subjective experience and touch another mind, another heart. The patterns and tendencies we've discussed tonight apply specifically to women on average, but the deeper lesson about approaching others with curiosity, about holding our assumptions lightly, about recognizing both pattern and uniqueness, about practicing empathy while accepting the limits of our understanding. These lessons apply to all human connection. Every person you meet is a world. Some worlds are more similar to yours, easier to navigate because the landscape feels familiar. Some worlds are foreign, challenging, requiring that you learn new languages and customs. But every world repays careful exploration with wonder and beauty. Every person has depths that surprise, complexity that defies easy categorization, stories that reshape how you see humanity. Women are not fundamentally mysterious or incomprehensible. They're human beings with all the clarity and contradiction that entails. What seems mysterious often reflects not actual inscrutability, but simply difference. Ways of processing and expressing that don't match your own default mode. And when we approach that difference, not with frustration, but with genuine curiosity, when we're willing to learn new languages and see through new eyes, what seemed mysterious becomes comprehensible. Not completely, never completely, but enough. Enough to connect, enough to care, enough to build something meaningful together. Thank you for listening tonight, for giving your time and attention to this exploration of psychology, neuroscience, hormones, communication, relationships, and the beautiful complexity of being human. Whether you're still awake, feeling sleepy, or already halfway into dreams, I hope you found something worthwhile in this journey. Perhaps tomorrow you'll approach someone in your life with slightly more curiosity. Perhaps you'll listen a little more carefully, notice a little more closely, ask a question instead of making an assumption. Perhaps you'll catch yourself falling back on stereotypes and pause, opening up space for the actual person in front of you to surprise you. Or perhaps this will all just become a pleasant, sleepy memory, and that's completely fine too. What matters is not that you remember every detail we've discussed, but that you carry forward a spirit of curiosity and compassion. That you recognize both pattern and individuality. That you understand the science while never reducing people to their biology. That you strive to bridge gaps in understanding while accepting that perfect comprehension is neither possible nor necessary. That you show up again and again with open hands and an open heart, ready to be amazed by the people in your life. The women you know, the women you'll meet, they're not puzzles waiting to be solved. They're not mysteries in need of decoding. They're simply human beings, walking their own paths, carrying their own stories, trying to make their way through this complex and often challenging world, just like everyone else. They deserve to be met with respect, with curiosity, with the willingness to really see them rather than the projection of who we assume they should be. And in the end, that's perhaps the deepest understanding of all. That understanding is not about mastery or complete knowledge. It's about showing up with humility and care. It's about recognizing our own limitations while still reaching toward connection. It's about honoring both the patterns that link us and the uniqueness that distinguishes us. It's about staying curious, staying present, staying human in our interactions with other humans. Think about the women who have touched your life. Maybe it's your mother, who shaped who you are in ways both obvious and subtle. Maybe it's a partner, who sees parts of you that remain hidden from others. Maybe it's a daughter, who teaches you as much as you teach her. Maybe it's a friend who has been there through years of change, through joy and sorrow. Maybe it's a colleague whose perspective challenges and expands your own thinking. Maybe it's a teacher, a mentor, a healer, someone who appeared at just the right moment to offer what you needed. Each of these women brought something unique to your life. Each processed the world in her own way, combining her particular biology, her life experiences, her choices, her values, into a singular human consciousness. What you've learned tonight about hormones and brain structure, about communication patterns and stress responses, these offer frameworks for thinking about why she might be the way she is. But they can never capture the full reality of her. She is more than her neurotransmitters, more than her evolutionary programming, more than her socialization, more than any pattern or category. She is a consciousness experiencing existence, with all the mystery and profundity that entails. And your relationship with her, whatever form it takes, is an ongoing dance between two consciousnesses, each trying to understand the other, each offering what they can, each hoping to be seen and valued. So, as you settle into sleep, or continue through your evening, or greet your day, wherever you are in the world, wherever you find yourself in this moment, carry this with you. Be gentle with yourself and others. Be curious about differences rather than threatened by them. Be willing to revise your understanding as you learn more. Be patient with the slow work of really getting to know someone. And be grateful for the remarkable diversity of human consciousness, for the many different ways of being human that we encounter in each other. The science we've explored tonight tells us that women's brains connect differently, that their hormones create different emotional landscapes, that they communicate with different defaults, that they respond to stress with different strategies. All of this is true and worth knowing. But the deeper truth is simpler and more profound. Women are human beings, complete and complex, worthy of respect and understanding, capable of extraordinary strength and touching vulnerability, deserving of being met with curiosity rather than assumption, with appreciation rather than judgment, with love rather than objectification. You've done enough for today. You've listened with care to ideas and research. You've reflected on what it means to understand others. You've made space for complexity and nuance. You've thought about the women in your own life, perhaps seeing them a bit differently now. You've considered how you might show up a bit more consciously, a bit more compassionately in your interactions. That's good work, important work, work that makes the world a bit kinder, a bit more connected. Now you can rest. Close your eyes if they're not already closed. Feel the weight of your body settling into whatever supports it, into softness and comfort. Let your breathing slow and deepen naturally, without effort or force. Allow thoughts to drift like clouds across a vast sky, interesting but not requiring your pursuit. Allow the day's concerns to recede like waves pulling back from the shore. The women in your life will still be there tomorrow, still themselves, still worthy of your attention and care. The patterns we've explored will still be true in their limited way, still useful as rough maps, while never capturing the full territory. The mystery of other minds will remain, beautiful and unbridgeable, an invitation to eternal curiosity. And you will still be you, learning and growing, sometimes understanding and sometimes confused, doing your best to connect across the space between consciousnesses. That's enough. That's always been enough. You don't need to understand everything to love well. You don't need perfect knowledge to show up with care. You don't need to master all the patterns to be present with an individual person. All you need is willingness, curiosity, humility, and kindness. And these things, these beautiful human capacities, they're already within you, waiting to be offered. Sleep well. Dream gently. Dream of connection and understanding, of all the ways we reach toward each other across the vast spaces between inner worlds. Dream of the women who have shaped your life and the women you have yet to meet. Dream of a world where differences are celebrated rather than feared, where understanding is pursued with patience rather than demanded with frustration, where everyone is seen for who they truly are rather than who they're assumed to be. And know that you are part of this vast human family, different and similar, unique and universal, forever learning the art of being with each other, the art of understanding, not through mastery, but through loving attention, the art of connection, not through certainty, but through humble presence, the art of being human together, with all the confusion and beauty that entails. Rest now. Let go. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities to practice what you've learned, to see with fresh eyes, to listen with open ears, to understand with a compassionate heart. But tonight, simply rest. You've traveled far in these thoughts. You've opened yourself to new perspectives. You've done the work of trying to understand. And that trying, that effort, that willingness to see beyond your own perspective, it matters. It makes a difference. It makes you a better friend, a better partner, a better colleague, a better family member. It makes the world a little bit softer, a little bit kinder, a little bit more understanding. Good night.